Reparations is a terrible idea. Mobilizing $1 trillion through the politics of the state on behalf of a program of racially defined redistribution is a terrible idea. Very bad for the country. South Africa-like categorization of its citizens, very bad for Black people. Sapping us of the possibility of dignity. It won't solve the problem. The issue here is differences in the capacity to generate wealth. If you don't address it, any wealth disparity will reemerge even if you reshuffle the deck. It's a terrible idea. Welfare of the 60s and 70s destroyed the Black family. Welfare of the 20s and 30s will destroy Black dignity. Affirmative action. It's a fraud. Black people have not penetrated the venture capital industry, the code writing industry in Silicon Valley or whatever it is, because not enough Black people have exhibited the skills necessary to succeed at those tasks. The old idea of mid-20th century that Black people are being kept out by animus, bias, and discrimination is false. Development of African-American people lags. Affirmative action is a Band-Aid, crime. The reason that you have so many incidents is because there are so many Black people breaking the law. The police are operating in these cities, as Coleman suggested, in the face of a reality, an outsized level of violence committed by Black people against each other. If we can't be honest about that, school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration and systemic discrimination, if we cannot be honest about what's happening in our communities, African-American communities, with the violent criminal behavior that makes life unlivable for most of the people there, we're not going to get anywhere. So could we begin this deep dive by being honest about welfare, honest about affirmative action, and honest about crime?
I want to go deeper than that. I hear what you said, and it's not that I disagree with any of it, but I also think it's not the root. The question is, why is there disproportionate crime? And I would argue that we have a systemic problem that is not fundamentally about race, but the race problem that we genuinely have plays into this economic disparity problem in a way that those who have not reached the bottom rung of the ladder, of course, more likely to engage in crime. It's what anybody would do, right? If you don't have legitimate opportunities, you will...
I'm sorry, Brett. Excuse me, I don't want to monopolize.
No, go ahead.
Is it really not patronizing a community to say of their criminals, it's what anybody would do, when you just got through saying, or someone did, that there are almost no Asians being killed by the police?
Good. All right. So let's take this apart and figure out what we actually are saying and what we actually believe. And I, of course, am open to be convinced that I have it wrong. But my point would be, you have a very different history for people of African descent who arrive in the New World, and you have a different history for Native Americans in the New World. And then those two populations have had unique dysfunction as a result of the fact that their origin stories are different than the other populations that are here. And so the only point that I'm really making, it's not that anybody would do any of these crimes. It's that when you don't have legitimate opportunities, you seek opportunities that are higher risk. Nobody wants to go to prison, and you don't choose to engage in things that will tend to get you sent there if you have good opportunities. But if you don't, you may engage in behaviors that are likely to run you afoul of the police. And so all I'm asking is, I think one of two things would have to be true. Either there's something about the Black population that is more prone to be criminal, or there's something causal that results in that population ending up in that category more frequently. And I believe strongly it's likely to be the latter. I've seen no evidence that this is endogenous.
Brett, I think all of that is true, but I think you're missing one part. And if we're talking about deep dive, this is deep and it's very hard to quantify. And it's partly why many people refuse to think about it, which is that there's a cultural issue, and it's not about Black culture going back centuries. It's not about Black culture even going back 50 years ago. But there was a turn in the mood in the 1960s where, in ways that fascinate me, how this percolated from a small radical group into a general mood in a whole community really fascinates me. But something happened between 1960 and 1980 that taught an awful lot of especially young Black men that Black authenticity involves checking out that Black authenticity means that you get a pass because the man doesn't like you. And as vague as that sounds, the difference between Black culture in 1970 and Black culture in 1950, even among the poorest, is stark and unmistakable. Something happened. And we still have the legacy of that. And so, to the extent that, living in New York City, this is something that nobody ever wants to say out loud. You'll read in the Times or you'll hear on NPR, 7 youths killed last night at a barbecue. And you don't even need to wonder. It's always Black people in certain neighborhoods. Now, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the people. But the question is, why aren't any poor white people doing that? Why isn't that happening in poor Chinatowns? Why isn't that happening in many towns in India? Poverty alone doesn't explain that. It's partly what came to be seen as normal in the wake of the Black power mood, and also the expansion of welfare with Black people in mind starting in 1966, which was pernicious for family relations, although nobody knew that's what was going to happen at the time. So I think you're right. Poverty is one thing, but to the extent that anybody here is bristling a little bit, it's because there's more. There's a Black thing. And it's a very hard thing to talk about, but it's there.
If you take men out of a population, it disempowers women in negotiations and mating and dating. Men who have lots of sexual opportunity because they're in high demand are hard to pin down. So they don't play the role of father, which means that to the extent that fathers are necessary to address questions of why you should restrain violent impulses, for example, their absence then manifests as increasingly violent crime, which goes to explain some of the patterns that several of you have mentioned about an increased propensity for Blacks to kill each other. So what I don't understand is why we aren't having that discussion. Right? Something causes incarceration of Black men, and that has a bunch of predictable effects.
I want to just insert, Steven Pinker's thesis in a book that I admire greatly, which is The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is about the enormous decline in violence over the past several hundred years of human history. And his thesis is basically that the question you should ask is not why does a certain group of people commit so much crime, but why do low crime populations commit so little crime? Because it could just be true that the natural state for members of our species is for young men to get together in groups and be ready for violence. There's nothing in human history that says that behavior is so pathological that it needs a special explanation. Really, what needs to be explained is the fact that we now have societies where young men don't behave that way. And as for crime disparities, if you look in the early 20th century and compare how much crime Irish immigrants were committing compared to Norwegian and Swedish immigrants, you find disparities every bit as large as between Blacks and whites today. If you look at the crime disparities between Southern whites and Northern whites, to this day, it's rather large. So what I want to say is there's nothing strange or cosmically unusual about two groups of people with very different histories, different cultures, different circumstances, committing very different levels of crime. And I'm in a way, it's the wrong question to ask to get to the bottom of why it is, unless, of course, you're solution oriented, which I am. I'm very curious about how we can lower crime rates, violent crime rates, and I'm dismayed that that conversation is either only used as a way of dismissing police violence or just seen as synonymous with racism.